encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. Conversations about life, Christianity, and culture. This is Four Preachers in a Podcast, Season 1, Episode 14. I'm Robert Hatfield in Henderson, Tennessee. There's Brad McNutt from Moulton, Alabama. Hey, Brad.
Hey, how you doing?
Great, great. There's Chance Hicks from North Charleston, South Carolina. Hey, Chance.
Hello. How are you guys?
North, South. That is the most confusing thing to tell people. Where are you from? North Carolina? No, North Charleston.
South Carolina.
Yeah.
It's confusing every time.
And a bewilderment unto himself is Hiram Kemp, who is in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Hello, mystery man Hiram. How are you today?
I'm here.
Our favorite thing. Oh, what? What is happening here? What?
It's called progress. We're making it.
Oh, never mind. He's remedied it.
He put it together.
He's got his highlighter in his hand so he can read while we're talking. All right.
Exactly. Hebrew vocabulary.
This is a challenging sayings episode. This is one of those episodes where we look at scripture and we're pulling out things, they're just hard. Sometimes they're hard to interpret. Sometimes they're hard to apply. Sometimes they're both. And today we've got, I think, an episode. We're going to talk about a saying that is pretty well known, but it is challenging in a variety of ways. Brad's at the helm. I'll let you introduce this challenging saying for Season 1, Episode 14.
All right. So we're going to be looking at Matthew 5, 13 through 16, and the discussion where Jesus says, you are salt and you are light, and kind of deal with the tension here. So there are a number of tensions that exist when we think about this. I mean, even in the sermon itself, right? So here he says, be salt and be light. And then later on, he says, if you read it, you could almost think like, oh no, he just contradicted himself. Don't do things in front of others.
Yeah.
So do things in front of others, but don't do things in front of others. So how do we handle that tension to begin with within the sermon? I mean, it's not that difficult to untangle, but we do need to think through it.
And people do struggle with this, right? I mean, so Matthew 6:2, when you give to the needy, don't sound a trumpet, because that's what the hypocrites do. 6:5, when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who love for people to hear them praying. 6:16, when you fast, don't look gloomy like the hypocrites. They want to be seen by others. So there was definitely something Jesus was specifically addressing there, but over against what he tells us in our text, right? I mean, you're supposed to be seen by others so they can see your good works, Matthew 5:16.
Yeah, and I think it's motive based. I think Jesus is saying you do good in public, but not for public. Like you do things, and if you are salt and light, people won't be able to miss it. But you don't have to circle back around just to make sure they didn't. Like if you want to do good, do it, and you should. People will realize that you're a Christian and God will get glory, but you don't have to have a sign when you do it. Like, hey, look at me, I've done this good thing. And I think in Matthew 6, in those instances on prayer, fasting, and giving, the motivation behind the activity is not the end of verse 16, so they'll give glory to your Father who's in heaven. It's more about give me glory who's on earth. And Jesus has a problem with that. And so God is stingy about his glory. And if we do things for our own glory, that's a problem. But if we do things for God's glory, people are going to see us doing it. That's sort of the point. But what are our motives behind why we do what we do? And I still think what Robert said, that's still, even when you figure that out, it's still a challenging idea, because we struggle with wanting people to know, like, man, I've done good, but we need to make sure we're doing it for God's glory.
Right. And I think it's an important thing that I try and talk about a lot, and that is doing the right thing for the right reason all the time. Putting those three things together, the right thing, the right reason all the time. And that's something he's very concerned with. So there's also another tension that kind of exists when we look at the rest of the New Testament. For an example, I think of like the call to be separate from the world. And this verse tells us we're supposed to be, we've heard the phrase in the world, not of the world. How do you handle that tension? 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 7:1, come out from among them and be separate. So, I mean, we obviously saw different reactions to this throughout the history of not just Christianity, but even back into the Jewish religions, you had a division that existed where you get the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and Zealots about how do we handle our relationship with our oppressive governments that are over us, the Greco-Roman Empire. Um, the Pharisees said, we're going to keep our hands solely away from that culture. The Essenes said, we're going to leave the culture altogether. The Sadducees said, we're going to wrap our arms around it and embrace everything about it. So, how do we handle the tension of being in the world but not of the world? And that can have a lot of tentacles to it that touch a lot of different things.
No, yeah, you're right. You think about Paul writing to Titus in Titus chapter 2. He says, the grace that's appeared to us teaches us to live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. So that is taking these principles from Jesus and the principles of Christianity and then trying to live that out so that the world can, through us, see our God and glorify Him. But at the same time, it's maintaining a purity and a holiness that we're called to. And so it's this balancing act of trying to engage with people, interact with people, influence people without allowing their life or the darkness that they might be consumed in to influence us and pull us into away from Jesus and back into that same kind of environment.
Yeah, you've got to be the agent that makes things better as a disciple of Jesus. The salt doesn't do anything for anybody all by itself, and light isn't helpful unless it's interacting with darkness. So there has to be some interaction, obviously. And hey, this leads us down all sorts of lines of thinking. I think about interacting with someone does not necessarily imply fellowship.
Exactly.
All that kind of stuff. In fact, we can't just sit up and basically be in compounds all by ourselves. If we're going to fulfill whatever Jesus means in Matthew 5:13-16, it necessitates that we're interacting, engaging to some degree with the darkness around us.
And I think that, you get into even those relationships, but you get into, I think, Dr. Gallagher in his book in the Sermon on the Mount discusses Christians have always struggled with this question, right? You have the Puritans in London who boycotted the theater district. Like you shouldn't be involved in theater. So you think about entertainment choices that we get into. At what point does that tide turn and it become an influence on us? Or the clothes that we wear, restaurants. When my first work, it was still a dry county, and that law was later overturned. But a lot of people struggled with, I don't know that I can go eat in that restaurant because they serve alcohol in that restaurant. Now, for me, I grew up in a place where that was as normal as anything else, and so how we handle these tensions. But Hiram, I want you to think about this tension is 1 Corinthians 9:19-23, where Paul says, but I'm able to become all things to all men. And I think, we go through these things, and sometimes you have people who are real hardliners and say no interaction with the world at all. But how
Yeah.
Paul had a way of connecting with people from all different walks of life. He had to have interacted with it somehow.
Yeah, he did. And he learned it from Jesus, right? Luke 15, 1 and 2 says that they rebuked Jesus because this man receives sinners and eats with them, which in the first century culture said a lot. It communicated something about, hey, why is he accepting and receiving these folks? Whatever, we've got to keep a few things in mind. One is people have personal scruples and personal conscience issues, and that's fine. They should never be rebuked or chided for that. That's fine. But beware of making just across the line laws for how everybody ought to interact with culture, because if we have any view of what it means to be salt and light that conflicts with what Jesus taught in John 17:15-17, then we've got the wrong view, where Jesus says there, I pray not that you should take them out of the world, but keep them from the evil one. That's the issue. coming out from the world, or even in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul says you'd have to go outside of the world. So any view of what it means to be salt and light that tries to take us out of the world in order to pursue holiness is not what the New Testament is after. It's we've got to be in this world without letting the world corrupt us. The same John that wrote that in John 17 also wrote 1 John 2:15-17. Don't love the world and the things in the world. It's the philosophies and the intellectual ideas of the world that can warp our view of God and of heavenly things. But 1 Corinthians 9 shows us that Paul went to different places and interacted with people and even embraced some of their cultural things in order to reach them for the gospel's sake. And he wouldn't have been successful if he would have had this totally withdrawn approach that refused to do that. And so he became all things to all men that he might save some. He did that not endorsing sin or anything like that, but in an effort to win souls. And so when we think about being salt and light, we should ask ourselves as we make these different decisions about entertainment or whatever, why am I making the decisions that I'm making? Am I doing this more so to keep myself safe, or to try to reach out and save and help other people to come to know Jesus? And if we want to help people come to know Jesus, we will on occasion have to be uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean uncomfortable doesn't equal unscriptural. And we've got to learn that and be able to deal with that so we can shine light and be salt, which has to touch the surface before it can impact it. You have to have some engagement before it makes a difference.
Right. I think that's really helpful. And I think that leads us kind of launching into these two pictures that Jesus uses for us. And that, of course, is salt and light. And, you know, sometimes ascertaining exactly the intent of Jesus, why he chose salt and light, and how, that's going to be difficult. There are tons of biblical reasons we could attach to them. But I think the basic premise of this text is simply this: point people to God. In your life, point people to God. And so there are these two statements. We'll begin with the first one, the image of salt, where he says, you are the salt of the earth. Now that's the plural. And so he's talking about those who would be his disciples. You are the salt of the earth. Okay. And so when we think about salt, who wants to kind of take the salt metaphor here and kind of flesh it out for us?
Well, I think even before we jump into salt, if you don't mind, Brad.
No, go ahead.
Talking about the two metaphors here, like I think that you're seeing some parallelism, which is pretty common in Jewish culture and even Jewish literature. You think back to the Old Testament, like the book of Proverbs, you have often either parallelism where you're saying the same thing in two different ways, or you might say the opposite thing. One common familiar one's Proverbs 16:18, where you have this synonymous parallelism. You have two statements that say the exact same thing, just in different words or different pictures. Pride goes before a fall, and a haughty spirit before destruction. And I think that's what you have here with Jesus. He's using two different metaphors or two different pictures, salt and light, but really there's not a major distinction between the two of them. He's trying to communicate that one singular thought about who we are to be as those who are pointing glory to God. And so he uses the imagery of salt, uses the imagery of light, but it's really one picture that he's trying to communicate.
Right. And salt was, when we get into the salt image, it was a very important component. As a matter of fact, I think the English word salary comes from this, because people were often paid in salt. I think people who served in the Roman army were paid in salt and things along those lines. So I guess if we look at it, salt and its usages, what kind of comes to mind, biblically speaking, of how Jesus is using it here? Because taste obviously has something to do with it, because Jesus said if the salt loses its taste, it's not good for anything. So what is the image that Jesus is driving at?
Man, salt makes everything better. So I often say, and people who are older can relate to it, right? I mean, if you've been on a low sodium or a no sodium diet because of, this or that, whatever health difficulty you've got, then you come to appreciate how valuable salt is. To your point, Brad, it was even used as a currency back in the day. I think, our English word salary derives from the Latin word for salt. Anyway, the flavor seems to be the the ultimate point. And so there are a lot of different applications you can go with that. Little goes a long way. You don't need a whole lot. And Jesus says later in this same sermon, Matthew 7, that there are few who find the straight and narrow gate, even though the majority of people seem to be going the wide gate that leads to destruction. So, even though we as Christ's disciples are fewer in number, that doesn't mean that great impact cannot nevertheless be done. Just an aside here, and then I'll let you guys pick back up with the positive stuff. I've read a lot, I'm sure you have too, about whether it's even possible for salt to lose its flavor. Of course, the point is that Jesus is making is not to debate, I don't think, whether this is possible, but instead to say, okay, salt that doesn't taste is worthless. Why would you use that? Mm-hmm. And that's the point that Jesus makes here, right? If the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything, thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You forfeit your usefulness if you aren't a disciple of Jesus who is adding positively to the world. I've heard that maybe some salt harvested by the Dead Sea, because of other minerals that were mixed in with it, could have eventually over time lost some of its flavor. I've also read counter points to that. Mm-hmm. Whatever the case, if it is possible for salt to lose its taste, it would be because you're adding other things to it and in a sense corrupting it. So there's a whole other application there. But, the overarching point, like you said, Brad, seems to be the emphasis is on taste. A little goes a long way. And if I'm not being this, we've got to get beyond just the useless salt and get to say, he's saying you are this. And so if you're useless, if you're not adding to, then you're useless as far as, being my disciple. That's a challenging saying in and of itself.
Can you imagine your McDonald's fries with tasteless salt?
Oh, no.
Well, you think, we're talking about, as you mentioned, the debating the possibility, can salt lose its taste? Well, in the next paragraph or the next metaphor, he's going to say, you can't hide a city that's set on a hill. You don't light a candle. Like, he's talking about things that are commonly understood as impossibilities or things that don't make any sense if you do them. So the point he's driving at is you're salt. Be it. Act in a way that's consistent with what you are. And in this particular, I've heard some people even point out here that salt it has a preservative element to it. Obviously was one of its main uses. That Christians, is this a parallel to something like a Genesis 18 and 19 when Abraham is pleading for Sodom? If you can find so many righteous people in it, the righteous within a society and its preservation, the church, as some people have called it, the church being the conscience of the culture. A lot of different things can go on here. What else do y'all want to add?
I was just going to say, piggybacking off of the idea of the preservation, Brad, that's important, because I heard a man say, for Christians, sometimes we got to fight two extremes. On the one hand, there's nostalgia, always wanting to go back to some sentimental longing of how great things used to be. But on the other hand, there's cynicism, where there's like, things are so terrible, they're never going to be right. The world just stinks and we can't wait to get out of here. And Matthew 5:13 is a corrective to both approaches, to say right now, do what you can, be salt in your generation. But it also fights against cynicism, which says everything's terrible. Christians should be what's right with the world, and we do need to impact and preserve the world in a Genesis 18 way, but just beyond that, there are good things that God has blessed us with here that he wants us to be a part of, making sure that people don't forget. And so we are the salt of the earth, and we are supposed to, like Robert said, make things better. We're supposed to impact our world for the good. And so when people interact with us, it should make a difference in their lives, and they should know when Jesus went into a town and did good, people walked away thinking, man, I've never met anybody like this. My life's totally different. John chapter 4, when he goes to Samaria, that whole town's changed. And that's because Jesus brought salt there. He brought a good influence and made a good impact. And we should be doing the same thing. People should know Christians for being that way. And I think that's part of what Jesus is driving at.
Chance?
Yeah. It's interesting. One of the Old Testament connections of salt, and maybe in the Jewish mindset, in the book of Leviticus, at least, and some other passages, Salt was connected with sacrifice and with offerings. And you connect this then with the previous statements at the end of the Beatitudes. Most Bible translations have between verses 12 and 13 a heading break. And so you almost see that like as a section break where we're leaving what Jesus just said behind and we're turning to something completely different. And so now we're leaving Beatitudes, we're turning to salt and light. But really, this is all tied together because he talks about in those last thoughts of the Beatitudes being reviled, suffering like the prophets. And then he says, now you're going to be the salt of the earth. And if you connect that salt with sacrifice or offering, right, you're going to go into the world and you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be reviled, and you're going to have to be willing, if you're going to be a disciple of Jesus, to sacrifice yourself, to endure that, to faithfully hold up under that. And we're following Jesus in that example, that we are in suffering, walking in the footsteps of Jesus, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21. And so one of the greatest ways that we get to be salt to the earth or light to the world is when the world hates us and reviles us, we respond like Jesus did, and we're shining light on who he is and shining light on God in that moment. Another thing that stands out here is going back to the thought of salt losing its flavor or losing its taste. That word is in other passages of the New Testament connected with the thought of foolishness. So you find it in Romans 1:22, professing to be wise, they became fools, or 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 20, has God made foolish the wisdom of this world. And so if you take that foolish aspect of it, then that brings you to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says, okay, let me sum up all of my sayings here. If you listen to my sayings and you do them, you're like this wise man. But if you hear these sayings of mine and you don't do them, you're like this foolish man who built his house on the sand. And so salt of the earth is hearing the sayings of Jesus and then living them. And then salt losing its flavor is hearing the sayings of Jesus and you saying, no, I think I'm going to set those aside and I'm going to pursue my own way, or just not going to live by the sayings of Jesus. Then you've had an opportunity to salt and influence the world for good, and you've lost your ability to do that.
Right. I think that's extremely helpful. And that's one of the things that surprised me. I was looking at some things and I'd forgotten that. But when you mentioned that the word itself carries with it the way it's translated in other places, it's kind of shocking when you look at the original word to think, why are we translating it tasteless? Because it kind of has a different connotation to it. So let's move then to light, which, the Bible and light, there are tons of connections. It can be used to describe, revelation. Light comes in, the light comes on for you. It can be used as hope. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, Matthew 4, 12 through 17. A light to the Gentiles, such as influence, which is probably got something to do with the underpinnings of this particular reference by Jesus. Isaiah 42:6, Isaiah 49:6, and then he makes it very practical, with two illustrations. One is an exterior. You've got a city up on a hill that can't be hidden. Like, it's impossible to do that. Even in times of war where you're trying to do something like that, it's impossible. Even if you had a blackout for the whole city, there's going to be that one person who has a candle up in their window, and the whole army found you because there's a candle up in the window. Or, how much sense does it make, in a time without electricity, to light a candle to give light to the house and then, put something over the candle? Like, it doesn't make any sense. That's what Jesus is coming at. And so he then reaches a conclusion and says, in this way, we're to do our good works before men, that they may see them and give glory to our Father who is in heaven. And so channeling that light, channeling people's direction back toward God. So what are our thoughts here about light? I mean, they're obviously going to be pretty similar to what we've already said about salt. But what do you guys think?
Yeah, I
think in the end, Jesus is. Go ahead, Chance. You let me go last time.
Okay, that's will do. All right, I think contextually, and if you're reading Matthew's account, like, to come to the Sermon on the Mount and to see that word light has to take you back to Matthew chapter 4, where he's connected this to the coming of Jesus into the world and fulfillment of prophecy from Isaiah. And he quotes from the servant song of Isaiah 42 that God's sending the Messiah into the world to be a light to the Gentiles. And so now Jesus is turning to those who are his followers and saying, and you also are light to the world. And so I think it's a way of Jesus saying, I'm inviting you in to be a part of my mission to the world of bringing hope and bringing salvation and bringing deliverance. Jesus said, I'm here on that mission, and I want you to be not only those who benefit from it, but those who are actively involved in helping that mission go out into the lives of others. And so Jesus is coming as a light to the world and a light to the Gentiles, not just to the Jews, but Jews and Gentiles, and inviting his followers to be involved in that same work and that same mission too.
Yeah, and I would just follow that up by saying Jesus is driving at the point that God put us here for a reason. Christians have a purpose, right? Like, you cannot be hidden. God didn't save us to put us off into a little corner or away from everybody. We're supposed to be here doing something good. We're supposed to make an impact and to change people's lives for some good purpose. Recently, I've talked with two different people, one a relatively new Christian and one an atheist. And both of them talked about this idea that they're struck by with Christians, that sometimes our entire focus is on heaven, but what about right now? And I know that can be taken in a negative way, but what they were driving at is, aren't Christians supposed to be focused on trying to do something for God right now and be the person that God wants us to be here? And so this idea of you're the light of the world, it's Isaiah 49:6 is behind this, where God's people are supposed to be a light to the nations. Where Israel failed, Christians can hopefully succeed, but God has us here for a reason. And so when we look around and see the world's dark, things aren't going our way, people are ungodly, it's never been darkness's responsibility. Darkness isn't supposed to shine light. It's our job. So if the world's dark, maybe we're not shining enough light. But I think what Jesus is driving at in this passage is, God's put you here for a reason. He didn't light you up to put you under a bushel or to hide you from the world. You've been infused with light. John 8:12, Jesus is the light, and it's supposed to make a difference and make an impact. And so as we look at our lives, we should be saying collectively, as Brad, you mentioned, these are plurals in the Greek. This is a, you all are the light of the world together, and we're supposed to be changing the world and making an impact. So there is a purpose behind our calling, and that is to point people to God because they see the light in us. And as they follow the light, at the end of Zechariah chapter 8 and verse 23, there's this looking forward to the new covenant age where the people will one day say, we've heard the Lord is on your side and we'll go with you. Where that's how it's supposed to go. People see our lives so impacted by the truth of New Testament Christianity that they say, man, I want that. And we've got a purpose.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Jesus says you are, and he says that this is a simple point, but it's present tense. You are, like right now, this is what I want you to do and to be doing. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And to the point that you guys have made all along, too many Christians are sitting around wringing their hands over what we've lost morally. And hey, there's no question in my mind that a lot has shifted in terms of our culture, particularly in modern America, although you could argue in the modern whole world, over the last several decades, right? I mean, things have moved very, very quickly. I can't reverse that. I don't know that we're going to swing back on the pendulum. I'm not a prophet nor the son of one, but I don't know that we're going to swing back on the pendulum back to the way that people, what people referred to as the good old days. I wasn't alive during those days. I don't know, but what maybe those days, at least as they were back then, as far as I'm concerned, they're gone forever. I mean, but the point is, Jesus says you're supposed to do this right now, and this applies in any culture at any time. It is interesting too, later, like Hiram just said, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. I can't call to mind a particular scripture. You guys might can, where, Jesus is directly connected with salt. He certainly does the good things that, he calls upon us to do in salt. And so in a sense, he's saying, I want you to be like me. I want you to go out on my behalf. And you're supposed to do this right now. So get going.
Exactly. And when you say, people are, I think I've heard one writer put it like they've taken away my country and I don't know where they've hidden it. And people, they look back on some of those things and say, those are the good old days. For those who are tended, who tend to lean that way, I would encourage you to think about that a little bit more holistically.
Mm.
And say, you mean the good old days when black people could not vote, or they were considered 3/5 of a person in taking a census, or so. Be careful, because in those good old, quote, good old days, we might have done some things right, but we were bad on other things. And in these days that you think are terrible, we're actually doing some things that are pretty good, but we might be loosening some things that in the past were in a better condition. So I think we need to be a little careful. And I know Robert that's what he's saying. Some
Yeah,
people are
yeah.
saying good old days. And for those who make that claim, we would just caution you to think about that claim a little bit
Yeah,
more
good old days
carefully.
for who? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing to think about too. The people Jesus is saying this to, they don't have a bunch of wealth, they don't have political power, and yet he says you can make a difference. I think that's the
Right.
heart of this. The Romans have their thumb on them. They don't. This isn't. These aren't the glory days of Solomon and David.
Nope.
They probably had their good old days too during the united monarchy of Israel. And Jesus is saying, hey, you've lost that, but you haven't lost the ability to point people to God, and that's most important. And so in our era, we need to be thinking, I'm unknown. I live in a small community. I don't. You're the light of the world.
Yeah.
You can still shine a light, and whatever that light is, we don't have to wonder, because Jesus parallels it with see your good works and glorify God in heaven. So you can do good works. And if you can do that, Jesus never left his hometown. He never traveled to different countries. He changed the world. And we can do that same thing right in our own backyard. And I think any difference that we will make will be at the grassroots level. And that's the thing we despise the most. We really want to make a big splash, but sometimes Jesus is saying, can you be just a little ripple right where you are? Like, can you do that right where you live and make a difference there? And let's just see what happens.
Well, and the darker the room, the larger the impact of a single light. I mean, my kids like a nightlight in their rooms. And when all the other lights are on, you can't even see that nightlight. But boy, does it shine. And I mean, it's really bright in there when it's pitch black dark in the middle of the night. I mean, it's just the way it is. If only there were like a whole podcast network dedicated to helping us be
Come on,
like a light or something. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah. But
Maybe
going
one
back,
day someone will come up with an idea like that.
they should call it the Light Network.
They should, that
we
now
could have
that
really used that.
you're on to something,
Used that 10
Chance.
years
Something.
ago.
Yeah, you're on to something.
But going back to what Hiram said about, making the small ripples where you are, we want to make a big splash, takes us back to the beginning of where we started this episode. Like, salt and light is about bringing glory to God, and so we have to reflect on, if we're only worried about making a big splash, what's really the motivation behind that? Bring glory to God, or making a big splash so that we can be seen to have made a big splash? So it's just using what we have, and if that turns into a big splash, wonderful. If it turns into a small ripple that affects one person and helps them to see God and glorify God, wonderful, and we ought to rejoice and celebrate in that. But every day ought to be a good old day, because we're with Jesus, he's with us, we're salting the earth, lighting the world, our names are written in heaven. So today ought to be a good day, tomorrow ought to be a good one too.
If only there was a podcast about living each day with Jesus, like, I don't know, every day with Jesus or today with Jesus. I don't know. It'd probably never work.
Nope.
I'm sorry. I'm in a shameless plug mode today. I don't know. Welcome to my world.
Idiot. Well, let's move then to the practical side of things.
Hey, before we move, I want to talk about life for just one more second.
Okay.
Brad's always moving on. I'm like, wait a minute, let's not do that yet. I think there is here, and I don't know just to what extent, to make the difference between the lamp and the city, but there is something here maybe for consideration of individual influence and community influence. So individually, I can in my circle of influence be a light, but even collectively, the congregation that I'm a part of ought to be a collective light in the community that we're in. And so maybe I'm an individual lamp, but as the congregation, we're a city and we're lighting the world. And even maybe then there's also some thought here about private life. This lamp
Mm-hmm.
you light and you put it in your house. So, and then this city is sitting on a hill for everything around it to see. And so maybe there is some consideration and application about thinking through my private life and my family life and my public life and my public persona, that in both of those areas, I'm called by Jesus to be an example and a light to the world and to reflect those principles of the Beatitudes and that character of life in both of those areas. You know, I think sometimes that can be difficult. We can put on a face and a show in public, but then at home and in private and in those moments wear a different face or be a different person. And Jesus is calling us to the same responsibility in both areas.
I think that's a very helpful application.
Hey, one
So,
more thing, Brad. I would just
no,
say,
we're done for now. Sorry. Green beans.
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
One more thing about expired green beans. No, but Chance was talking about the city and the light, and it made me think about the end of Revelation 21. And
Mm.
John saw a temple, and he calls it the bride. And I know we kind of want to jump toward heavenly language, but part of what John is saying in Revelation 21 is about the church. And he says, in that city, there is no need for sun or moon to shine, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. Verse 23. By its light will the nations walk. Kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Its gates will never be shut, and there will be no night there. They will bring into a glory and honor of the nations. And so John is saying there's a sense in which this is what the church accomplishes, and this is the glory that they derive from the Lamb. The light is there, and we're supposed to be bringing that to the nations. We're supposed to be bringing that where we live. And again, Jesus has us here for a purpose. So we can't do the monastic thing and get away, but we also can't surrender our light and mix in with the darkness. We're supposed to be that city that people can't miss, even if they wanted to. Our community should know us not just for being, oh, y'all got this sign on the church building that says you're of Christ, but because we actually have been flavor in our world. We've actually made a difference, and we've done things that wouldn't have been done otherwise. In the first century church, yes, there was persecution, but Acts 2:47 says they had favor with all the people. And then the Lord added to the church day by day those being saved. There were some that hated the church, but some that favored her. If we're just hated on all sides and people can't stand to see us coming, I don't know if we're being faithful to the New Testament. Jesus was hated by some, but yes, he was still loved, and people knew he made our community and our world better. Eternally, yes, but also in the immediate. And that's our responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
We're supposed to be the light of the world, and people shouldn't have to wait to get to the next world to see that. Like, we're supposed to be the light, like Robert was saying, present tense right now, ongoing light of the world.
And isn't that what Jesus is driving at? I mean, he's driving at the positive attributes of these. You know, I've heard people talk about, well, some people won't like it when you turn the light on. And that's true, right? Jesus said that in John 3. Men love darkness rather than light. If I'm in a dark room and I'm sleeping really well and somebody comes in and turns the light on in the middle of the night, I'm not going to appreciate that. Same thing is true. You know, salt can sting in a wound. Okay, we understand that. I don't think that's the sentiment that Jesus is driving at, though, in Matthew 5. So let's not take his analogies and twist them in ways that he didn't intend in this text, in the context.
Exactly.
He's appealing to the positive qualities of salt and light, respectively.
And I'm pretty sure Hiram's reading of Revelation 21 is heretical. I share it, but I'm pretty sure it's heretical.
No, what's heretical is that he alluded to Revelation at all.
Oh, sorry.
Right.
Sorry.
I mean, anyway.
So, anywho, well, let's move
Wait,
quickly.
for the uninitiated, that was a joke. Okay,
yes, sorry.
so.
Yeah.
Now that you wanted to move on, we've all stopped you once. So.
Yeah.
Anyway. So I guess the question we have to ask ourselves in looking at all this is where it gets a little bit harder. And that is, are we fulfilling the mission? So there's this statement by John Stott in his book, in the Sermon on the Mount. And you have to take it, pardon the pun, with a grain of salt here. Okay.
Hey-yo.
He's not saying, he's not ignoring the other side. You have to understand the spirit in which he's saying it. It says, and when society goes bad, we Christians tend to throw up our hands in pious horror and reproach the non-Christian world. But should we not rather reproach ourselves? No one blames unsalted meat for going bad. It cannot do anything else. The real question to ask is, where is the salt? And so Yeah, I understand the text that evil men and seducers will wax worse and worse. 2 Timothy chapter 3. That the world in its sinfulness will digress in that sinfulness. But at the same time, at what point do we look at? I mean, I hear a lot of people in their cultural commentaries, they will not take responsibility and say, you know what? People look, say, at what they call the dissolution of marriage, which is a wildly strange title, but they'll say, marriage has dissolved in America. Well, I wonder if the church contributed anything to that along the way, in the way that we taught it, the way we didn't teach it, the way we handled it. At what point does the church not have to look at itself and say, did we do something to contribute to the current condition? That doesn't mean that we're all guilty and we alone bear all the guilt. It's just saying, it's really an introspective question where we're asking ourselves, have we in certain areas not done the job we could have done? And if we're honest, I think all of us would have to say, yes, there are ways where we have blown this opportunity to point people to God in the way we handled situations. Basically, the question is, a second question that comes along with this is my example personally a hindrance to pointing people to God or a help in pointing people to God? Mm-hmm. And, how do I talk to people, even people with whom I disagree? How do I talk? How do I interact with, God forbid a waiter or a waitress get something wrong that I ordered? Mm-hmm. I find it extremely sad that if you talk to people in the food service industry, the day that they hate the most is Sunday for two reasons. You have church people who are demanding and notoriously bad tippers. People say that's got nothing to, it's got everything to do with something. Mm-hmm. It tells you something about, listen, it's not just the big things that matter, it's the little things that matter. That I can get up here and say, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, but I'm going to talk to you like a dog because you didn't get my Dr. Pepper here at a time I thought was appropriate. Yeah. Like, how do you treat people? What do you do? How do you talk to people? That's the real nitty gritty of how we live this out. Mm-hmm. Is not even just handling people, as Jesus will say later, who love us, but handling people who hate us, or with people who make mistakes who are human. That's really, if you get mad and if you make a snarky comment to a waiter or a waitress because they messed up something, listen, that's what they're expecting, because that's exactly how the world acts. That's darkness. That's a lack of salt. But if you look at them and say, hey, don't worry about it, not a problem at all, I'll drink what you brought me, or, just when you get a chance, you can bring me, it's not a big deal. Mm-hmm. What stands out as different in their world, in their mind? Which approach is different? Which approach would make them think, well, that's kind of different than what I normally experience? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm rambling on and on, but it gets to that point. What do you guys think when we look at this, fulfilling this mission as a church, as ourselves? How do we do this?
I think one of the most challenging
question. I was going to say whatever Hiram's going to say, so I'm gonna defer to Hiram. He stole my thoughts.
I was going to say the challenging thing I think we face a lot of times is remembering Christianity is more than just coming to worship services. Yep. I think for a long time, people have equated that with faithfulness across the board, and congregational worship and activity is important. But maybe we've lost some cultural ground because we've hid our light in our buildings. And that's important. Coming together for worship, Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. There are some things you can't do without the assembly. You need that. But then we've gone to the ball field, we've gone to work, and maybe we've been rude, and maybe we've had PhDs in jerkology, but maybe that's not been our thing. Maybe it's been more of the case that, like, we just haven't said anything about God. Like the people in Daniel 6 know Daniel is so godly that they say in Daniel 6:5, if we're going to catch him with anything, it's between him and his God. And so we might be known as church attenders, but that's not the same thing as being known as a worshiper of God. And I think sometimes we've hid our light under a bushel because the culture has become so antagonistic. We've just tried to be polite, silent partners with Jesus. And so some of that, like, you can come on too strong, obviously. Bob Goff has that quote, shine your light, but don't leave your high beams on, blinding everybody and irritating everybody. Yeah, there's a sense in which we need to be wise and we need to have common sense. But I think we've hid so much light in our buildings. Like, we talk about homosexuality. Okay, we can talk about how sinful that is in Romans 1, and we've got an echo chamber. But let's go study with some homosexuals. Let's go talk to some people that are same-sex attracted. We can talk about the sin of abortion, and yes, it's an abomination. Now let's go talk to some of these teen mothers and let's try to go save some souls. Let's interact with them. And I've been involved with that and been with Christians that have done that. I'm just saying, on the whole, I feel like I could have done more and can do more, and we need to do more. And I think it involves us realizing Christianity can't be summed up with a pulpit, a pew, and a preacher, and what we do for 3 or 4 hours at a church building. And a lot of times when we talk about faithfulness to God, even if we're describing another Christian, that's typically what we mean. I've heard this so often. He's faithful, comma. He's here every time the doors are open. Yeah, and so are some roaches and stuff in our building. Like, that doesn't mean anything. Like, that doesn't mean anything in and of itself. That doesn't mean something.
Wow.
It's important. It's just not.
So are the
end all
roaches that
be
have been
all.
in these green beans for a year.
That's
I
right.
mean,
Yeah.
come on. I think shining our light and being salt challenges us to make an impact. Like, do we even know our neighbors? And I know it's a different time, a different world, but what are we doing to make an impact? I just feel like Jesus went to towns, he made an impact, he connected with people. Paul did the same thing. And sometimes Hiram's in Hiram's own little world. I just go to my building, I go to my office, I do my little study thing. I've got my family, my thing, and we become so privatized as people. I feel like we don't talk about this enough. The challenge is actually interacting with people. COVID didn't help this, but we're just so broken off from people that, like, we can look like pretty just moral civilians and nobody will connect any of that with Jesus. But hey, y'all are just pretty nice and good people. You don't bother anybody, but I wouldn't connect your livelihood or your life with the fact that you're a Christian. And we're in our own little cubby holes. And Jesus is saying, no. And I know it's a scary world out there. And I know we kind of, man, we can't trust anybody. We want to be by ourselves. We're never going to make a difference that way. And we can have perfect attendance and great for us, but that's not going to change anything.
And the thing is that salt is always salt and light is always light. You can't just be salt and light on a temporary basis in a worship service. It has to be there every second you're alive.
And I feel
I
like
just want to say, I believe in worship service. I'll be here all the time. Just
that
so
ain't
y'all
that
know.
ain't what I heard.
I feel like in the modern culture, you almost have more to prove once you identify that you are a churchgoer. You know, there was a time, and maybe like in some songs and stuff, people would talk about preachers being, you know, like trustworthy and steady kind of people. I'm not sure that's the perception of the general public anymore. And I think the same is true of just people who go to church. You know, and I don't think it's just a particular group, you know, or whatever. I mean, I think it's oh, you're one of those. You know, you do that on Sunday. That must mean that you're against this or that. Or, oh, you're a preacher. Are you embezzling funds? Can I trust you with my children? You know, I mean, it's stuff like that. And so the necessity of being the real deal and being authentic and letting other people see God by our good works is even more important perhaps now than it was in times past, at least in recent America.
Hey, Robert, I would just say this real quick based on what you said. Sorry to cut you off, but you made me think
No,
about
it's the
something.
third
I've either
time. It's
said it
fine.
Here on
We're not
God
counting that.
Magnified. When I worked at KFC one time, I was a manager there before I became a preacher, and there was a guy, and he was the area manager, and I was working as an assistant manager with another lady who was running the store. And he told her, he didn't know I was religious or anything about me. He said, you got to watch food costs, make sure you count up your stuff, don't lose anything. And he said, especially the religious people, like if a guy says he's a deacon or goes to church or something like that, just be sure to keep an eye on people like that. I don't know his religious background. I don't know why he said that. He didn't seem to be an antagonistic person toward religion. I spent a lot of time around him, but something, it seems, in his background or in his history made him skeptical, especially about people that claim to be religious. So when you were saying that, I'm thinking that's not hypothetical.
Wow.
I don't want to say his name, but yeah, he did say that to this general manager about, you just got to watch people that are always talking about how much they love the Lord because they can't be trusted.
Brad, your questions challenged me earlier, and I was thinking about this. You know, are we fulfilling this mission? And is my example a help or a hindrance in pointing people to God? And, you know, Chance drew this out. I think it's in the text, you know, like Chance does, and like I think we all do, that there is a a singular component and a group component. You know, the word "you" is plural. Jesus was talking and addressing his disciples, you know, somewhat in mass. You know, you could argue the lamp on a lampstand over against the city on a hill. You know, the singular light versus a collective of lights going together. There's always going to be some issue, right? That's going to arise in our modern time. It seems like maybe the issues of our generation are plentiful. So, you know, I mean, to what extent did we contribute, or did we, you know, exacerbate some of these issues by our lack of being salt and light? I don't know. And maybe we did or didn't. I think back like to what God told Ezekiel, you're a watchman. And so, you know, under your watch, you're responsible for whatever you got going on. And what did Ezekiel do to be born in the time in which he was born? Or for that matter, you know, Isaiah or Jeremiah or any of these prophets that were born in, which is basically all of them, in really difficult circumstances. I mean, you've got to be a faithful steward of the message of God and a faithful servant of God in every circumstance. And I think congregationally, we have to ask ourselves questions like this. And you may be like, well, I'm not an elder, I'm not a deacon, or I'm not a preacher, so I can't really influence the congregation as a whole. But that's just not true. And I think one of the areas that we really need to give a lot of attention to is the way that we relate to one another in upholding the unity of the body of Christ at the congregation where we worship. It's not okay to trash talk members of the church. It's not okay to air your dirty laundry. It's not okay for you to have a disagreement with somebody that gets to the point that you're stewing on it for a long time and you just don't do anything about it, or you just go to the church across town. That stuff isn't okay. Jesus addresses it over and over. Romans 12 talks about it. I mean, it's everywhere. We need to realize that we're doing significant damage to the church, and we are lacking in our mission of being salt and light, in part because we are not accurately thinking about our contributions to the unity of Christ. They'll all know that you're my disciples if you have love for one another, that they all may be one, so that the world may know that you have sent me. All right, so there's a direct correlation between our mission as salt and light and the extent to which we are unified in the way that God wants us, or that Jesus wants us to be. And then when you turn that individually and you just ask, okay, am I being the consistent kind of Christian that I'm supposed to be? Do I have a short temper? You know, am I one way at work and a different way at church? Am I one way with family, a different way with friends? You know, we just need to ask ourselves those tough questions. And then not just that, but like Hiram said, you know, moral civilians, we just kind of blend in the background. You know, am I actively shining the light? Am I actively, you know, sprinkling the salt or whatever, being salt, so that I can help somebody? I think that we've got to think through these things a little bit. I said something I didn't mean to.
It's
No,
salt.
you
It
Hiram
has to be
did
thrown
the
over your left shoulder. Spread it.
I was sprinkling for us. That's good. Yeah, left shoulder.
Left shoulder.
I mean, I don't know what you're talking about.
I would think, thinking through areas where we could be better salt and light, maybe as one area is in the realm of joy and rejoicing. We can sometimes tie our joy and our rejoicing to the ups and downs of life, just like the world. And so when difficulties come, when challenging things happen, when we suffer difficulties, our joy goes up and down just like everyone else. But there's an area where we could make a great impact by having a different kind of joy. You think about Acts 16:25, Paul and Silas are in prison just like everybody else, and they could have been engaged in the same kinds of can't believe we're here or the moaning and groaning of the other prisoners, but instead they demonstrated a different spirit of joy because they reflected over their connection to Jesus and how their life with Jesus and the impact of Jesus has changed them and given them a greater hope. And so they are praying and singing praises, and their joy gives an opportunity for them to talk about Jesus. And so maybe that's an area where we have not done as well as we could and where we could make some improvement, just allowing our knowledge of Jesus and the joy that we have in him to overflow and to be present and seen in our lives, even when circumstances are difficult and things are challenging, that we don't let it drain the joy that we have and the hope that we have of our glory with God.
All right. I think that's all been helpful. I've learned a lot just listening to you guys and watching Robert eat his lunch in between screenshots.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Whatever, Mr. Shameless Self-Promoter.
Coke Zero, the drink of champions.
Just yuck.
It's no Dr. Pepper.
It's zero, which means the taste is awful. That's what it means. About like diet.
Oh, Hiram's got Pop-Tarts over there.
What I'm talking about.
Chance got some gummy cluster nerds. I've got Nutter Butter Bites. You know? What do you got? Chips Ahoy with Reese's. Brad ain't playing around.
Anywho,
you live the life over there.
I'm done with my part. Robert, you can take us to the end.
What do you got? Free 1 dozen original glaze.
I gotta wait till the sun's hot.
Well, you know what? Here's the
screenshot that. Everybody, you can steal Chance's free hot.
Here's the only bad thing about Krispy Kreme. When
you let your light shine,
Krispy Kreme donuts. When you get Krispy Kreme donuts, they're still Krispy Kreme donuts.
You're not a Dunkin' guy, are you?
No, I am a Shipley's. That's what I was raised.
Oh, there you go. This guy needs your local donut shop. That's what he needs.
Yeah.
But dude, when you can get one of those, when you can get one of those hot
Krispy
now,
Kreme, I'll forgive you.
And you stick it in your mouth and it just dissolves, and
That's
so you
not
eat
what happens
a
at
dozen.
Krispy Kreme.
Oh, it does.
No,
so good.
It's amazing.
No, I will take you to get real donuts.
You've taken me to get that, and I love them all. I'm not except Dunkin'.
Yeah, man.
Yeah,
it's just okay. I can take a blueberry from Dunkin'. Anyway, what are we doing? Sorry. This is Four Preachers and a Podcast, and sometimes we digress. Our season will be coming to a close before too awfully long. We do this at the Light Network. We take a break in the summertime, but we appreciate your feedback. In fact, the final 2 episodes in our season are listener feedback episodes, and so we wanted to make sure that we got to those. We've received some other correspondence in the meantime, and that correspondence has already begun to populate our plans for season 2. And if you've got ideas, thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, you can direct those to Hiram's mom on Facebook.
There we go.
And then, alternatively, you can email us, mail@thelightnetwork.tv.
Send them to mom account.
I hope somebody legitimately does contact your mom, and I hope your mom has no idea
what they do not.
Just tell her Hiram sent you. You'll get the family discount. Okay.
We're gonna have Hiram's mom on now. Like
we are.
She's already famous, and she's never even been here. So.
Four Preachers and a Podcast releases every Friday from TheLightNetwork.tv, and our podcast partners. Basically, anywhere you can get a podcast, search for Preachers and a Podcast. You'll find us. Hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Next week, we have a Can You Help episode, season 1, episode 15. We'll see you then. Stay cool.
For Preachers and a Mom.